Welcome to another information security lecture. Today's lecture will try to answer one very fundamental question. Why does your browser trust HTTPS website? And when does it show a lock icon in the browser if you try to call a URL? So what makes this kind of communication secure? And all of you know basically, well, the prefix, or when your browser says something like HTTPS, and meanwhile, since most pages use HTTPS, people or browser vendors actually start to strip away the header and the beginning prefix stating HTTPS. But still, it very often remains unclear what is behind the scenes. So why does your browser trust this site? What makes it secure? When does your browser draw the line? Where does it draw the line and say this website is not secure? So this is to keep this secure. This is an integral part of the web we're using on a daily basis. Today's lecture should give you a good insight into how browsers decide that a website is trustworthy and what server administrators have to configure in order to ensure secure transmissions. And yeah, so what we're going to talk about today is all these properties that browsers evaluate when websites are called. And I'd like to start with a brief crypto crash course. I will quickly recap things you've already heard in the first information security lectures about asymmetric cryptography, parts of symmetric cryptography, but less from a mathematical point of view, but rather in the context of network security. Of course, the focus, don't worry, we won't go back to deep crypto again. The emphasis will be on network security, but reminding these essential the essential crypto aspects is of course important for that context. So after that, we will have a look at the handshake. This is essentially what your browser does when websites are called via TLS or after you enter HTTPS. And within this handshake, certain very security critical attributes are evaluated. And the most important of these two are the cipher suite and a transmission mechanism or something to ensure security in your communication. This is called perfect forward secrecy. So since we cannot prevent all kind of attacks, even if the handshake works out securely, if perfect forward secrecy is there are still certain attacks we have to protect from. And so far we know of two mechanisms to achieve this. One is HTTP strict transport security, or in short HSTS, and the other one certificate pinning. So after this lecture you should be familiar with TLS, with the handshake, the relevance of the cipher suite, and of course the additional security mechanism we have there. So just as a quick recap, really, I don't want to bore you with that again. You've already gone through this in another lecture, but this is important. So just to remind you, since it's already a few weeks, what is asymmetric cryptography? With asymmetric cryptography, you use a key pair, you have a private key and a public key, they are linked to each other, and when you decrypt something, then only the person holding the private key can decrypt a certain encrypted message and will then based on that retrieve the plain data again. If you want that someone re-encrypt something for you, you would hand out that person your public key. So public in the sense, really, the key is public, everyone can have it, you can share it, someone can use this key to encrypt the message for you, and only you as the holder of the private key can then decrypt the message again. So based on these names you can even distinguish the kind of key. And since encryption with asymmetric cryptography is usually expensive, takes a long time, usually you only use this for small chunks of data. So let's say you wouldn't encrypt an entire file of, a video or an image using asymmetric cryptography. Sure, it would work, but it would take quite a long time. And since just imagine you're using YouTube, you're streaming a video, if you would encrypt entire videos of hundreds of megabytes using asymmetric cryptography, the performance would just be, well, not usable. So for that reason, what we mostly do is to encrypt bigger transmissions using symmetric keys and wrapping the symmetric key in with asymmetric cryptography. So in other words, we generate, for example, a symmetric key, then use that to encrypt our data using AES, for example, and we then encrypt the symmetric key using an asymmetric scheme. So a symmetric key, like in the case of AES 128, is just 16 bytes. So this amount of data is perfectly suitable to be encrypted with asymmetric schemes like RSA or ECC. And if we do this is also called wrapping or hybrid encryption scheme. What you can also do with asymmetric cryptography is signing and verification. So rather than just encrypting or decrypting something, we can also sign data. And you as the holder of a private key, you can, for example, say, I'd like to testify this is really my signature, or I think some of you are also familiar with the Austrian mobile phone signature. If you sign a document, a PDF like this, it exactly works like this. So you, for example, you have a key, a private key, and only you are the holder. Then a hash sum of the document is calculated, for example, via SHA-256. Then you use the private key to sign the document, for example, using ECDSA or RSA PSS, and based on that, you get a signed hash, and this signed hash can then, for example, be embedded in the document. Of course, the receiver of such a document can use your public key, the one associated with a private key, to actually verify that you have indeed signed a certain hash, and compare the hashes. By comparing the hashes, for example, you give someone a plain data, you generate a hash sum of that, and the person can compare whether the hash you have signed as the holder is really the hash the person calculated for the document. In other words, the other person can make sure the document has not been manipulated, and you, for example, signed the whole document. So this is the basic idea. And again, since asymmetric cryptography is expensive, we usually do not calculate a signature on the whole document, but first we calculate a hash sum of the document and we sign the hash. So remember, if you change something in a file, then the hash sum will also change. So this is already ensures integrity. So another relevant or another important mechanism in this context is Diffie-Hellman. You've also heard about Diffie-Hellman. The idea is, so Diffie-Hellman is a procedure for key agreement. You do not actually exchange a key, but you have two parties, like a client and a server, and you want them to agree on a key. So agreement really means that each side contributes something, and you mix these two inputs, basically from both sides, to derive a shared secret. And this shared secret is never exchanged. It's never actually transferred from one side to the other. It's really just two parties contribute something, like a prime number in this case, and based on the combined result, there will be a shared secret. So by not actually transmitting the secret, you reduce the risk for eavesdropping. And in the case of Diffie-Hellman, what both parties contribute is actually a prime number P and a natural number G, which is not secret, only the prime number. The trick here is to use a mathematical function, and which is easy to calculate but hard to reverse. So remember, this is something you've already heard about hash functions. So even if certain aspects of the transmission are actually known, it should be hard to actually reverse this function. This is what makes this difficult for attackers as well. As an analogy, we can for example say you're trying to mix two colors, and it's easy to mix two colors in order to get the third color, but it's actually hard to revert back from this third color to the initial colors, these two colors which were used in order to get the third color. So in the context of server and client, what we do is server first determines Diffie-Hellman parameters. As already said, this is the prime number and the natural number, and generates a public-private key pair. It sends these parameters and the public key to the client. So really only the parameters, the group, the finite group used within the Diffie-Hellman mechanism, and the public key, but of course not the private key, because as you've just heard, the private key is secret and you should never leave your device. You should never give it out of your hands. The client does the same things and then a shared secret is calculated. So both agree on a shared secret, both come to the same secret. So for example, on the client side, the client just uses the server's public key, which is public, as the name says. The client private key, which was never transferred, it's combined using a mathematical procedure, and you get a shared secret. And the server does the same thing using its own private key and the client's public key, which it just received. So that's the basic idea, but you've already heard about this. Where we actually use this is, of course, usually, so in this example it says user 1, user 2. Instead of that, you could also imagine this like client and server, which is the same setting. So when we use this to transfer data asymmetrically, we actually use exactly the scheme. So how would you do that? Of course, first you exchange the public keys. After that, using the private key, you can generate a shared secret, as you've just heard. So the resulting symmetric key will never be transferred. It is a shared secret, so both parties know about it, can encrypt data for each other, but since it's never exchanged, the risk for attacks that an attacker can actually eavesdrop there will greatly be reduced. And as you can see in this graphic, it says here DH, so this is the mechanism here, like Diffie-Hellman, and instead of just using Diffie-Hellman on finite groups, you can replace the multiplication and exponentiation which you do on finite groups with regular Diffie-Hellman with a point addition and scalar multiplications using elliptic curves. So you basically, instead of these finite groups, you just use elliptic curves for that. That's another a variant of that. It's basically the same mechanism, but the operations are slightly changed. So this is just to keep in mind for later. Especially in the context of web and servers, we're using certificates. So you're all familiar. You go to a website like google.com and you see that the website has a log icon. If you click on that, well, just let's exercise this probably briefly. You see that this certificate is valid and it's been issued by someone. So how does google.com actually get its certificate? Well, if let's say I'm the owner of google.com, which I'm not, what I would do, but I want a certificate that browsers would trust. So I would contact a certificate authority. For example, in this case, the certificate authority with Google was called GTS. Doesn't really matter which one. It could also be Let's Encrypt or any other one. And I would then say, look, I want you to issue a certificate for my website. And therefore, I send you a so-called certificate signing request, which you should please sign. So in other words, remember, this works just like this is a digital signature, and this works exactly like this. So you generate, as a website owner, you generate such a certificate signing request, and the hash sum of this certificate is signed by a so-called certificate authority using the private key. So they never hand out this key, and your browser trusts this key. What you get back is a signed certificate. So just like the example you've just heard a few slides ago regarding digital signature. On the other side, what your browser does, it actually will receive the certificate, like when you go to google.com or Google AT. It will see the fingerprint that was signed by a certificate authority, will take it and check whether the signer is actually the certificate authority using the public key. And if it sees, yeah, this is indeed the certificate authority that has signed the certificate, then it will say, hey, the certificate is trusted. So where does the browser actually learn that it should trust the certificate? Why is, for example, why does a browser trust GTA CA 010, or what is it, 101? That's something we'll also talk about today, later on. But there is, of course, more behind the scenes what your browser does. And this is just an overview of what happens during this validation phase. So if you go, for example, to a website called secureexample.com, what your browser first does, and your browser is the red window here below, it first checks whether the host name you just called matches with the certificate subject. I mean, this is something evident. Let's say you requested, as a website owner, you requested a certificate for google.com, then of course this should also be stated within the certificate. Why? Because otherwise, let's say it shouldn't be possible that you go to online.tugrants.at and then you're shown a certificate for Google AT. So your browser should detect this. This is called host name mismatch. So if your browser actually sees a certificate for the domain you just called, it will continue with validation of the signature. Or actually, in fact, it's a verification. So you go there, your browser receives a certificate that includes a public key and a signature. It will use that to check in its trust store a list of trusted issuers, whether it knows this issue and sees, okay, this is indeed an issue that I trust. So how does it work inside? You already saw it here. There is a reference to issued by. So in fact, this is exactly the same thing we have here with the certificate. It includes a reference to a certain issuer. And if this issuer, and of course a public key also, and based on a combination of signature and the public key, your browser can verify whether this certificate has indeed been issued by that certificate. So of course for signing, for this signature, the private key from the certificate authority was used. So that's the same thing I've just told you. This is just a different view on that. So understanding about these certificates is important, because what we do with TLS is just the application of all that. So this is the fundamentals. And of course, just for the sake of completeness, let me say, it's here you see, for example, it's a subject super secure TLS CA, issue super secure TLS CA. So in this case, if the subject and the issue of a certificate are the same, it means basically the certificate issued itself. So the CA signed itself. It's like signing a document for yourself. And this can also be the case. This is also called root certificate authority. But this hierarchy, as you can see here, for example, this certificate has been signed by that one, or using such a signer, there can be multiple steps. So usually we will have a hierarchy, and in practice this looks like the path. So for example, as you can see here, the Google AT certificate was signed by that signer, and that certificate was signed by this one. And this one has signed itself. So it's issued to global sign by global sign. But don't worry, we'll come back to that later on. So today's topic, as you know, is transport layer security. And I just gave you an overview about a recap, mostly, about what you've already heard about asymmetric, symmetric cryptography, signatures partly, and certificates. So still you might answer, or ask yourself, well, what's the practical use? How is this employed with TLS? So TLS is a key protocol for secure communication. It's really the standard we have there. There is nothing better out there meanwhile. And we're not only using it for HTTPS, but also other applications which might not be that obvious. For example, whenever you use a VPN, the confidentiality of your transmission is ensured using TLS. So that's what's going on behind the scenes. If you're using Outlook or Thunderbirds to receive your emails from your student's email account, your email program will most likely use IMAP or POP as a protocol, and on top of it, the communication will be encrypted using, or basically below, to be precise, will be encrypted using TLS. So basically any kind of communication where we use certificates, and this is nowadays 90%, is using TLS, which makes it highly important for our the use of internet. It's designed to operate on TCP, which means there, for reliability reasons, usually no use cases with UDP, except for a protocol, which is more like a niche, called Datagram Transport Layer Security, or DTLS. And if you've already heard about a bug called Heartbleed, which became famous in the use of TLS and OpenSSL, this was exactly in this domain. So it wasn't really related to UDP, but it went unnoticed for quite some time because TLS over UDP is not really popular. So mostly for reliability, we're using it with TCP. The initial development of the whole thing began already in the 90s from Netscape, and it was first integrated into the Netscape Communicator, which was a browser, but already died for a long time, and named Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL in short. And that name is so popular, that became so popular, that very often nowadays you also still read about SSL. While what we actually mean is TLS, Transport Layer Security. TLS is, very often used as a synonym. This is not really precise, because with SSL we actually, from a technical level, only the first versions of TLS are associated with. So when Netscape developed the whole thing, in 1995 they released SSL 2.0. And 2.0 was more like a draft, which due to a technical need became standardized, or not really standardized, but implemented and distributed. And critical security flaws were obvious from the very beginning, and which is why it was banned very briefly afterwards. Unfortunately, this led to many security problems. A lot of browsers and servers supported SSL 2.0 for a long time. So support means it was possible that communications would get downgraded to SSL 2.0. And only by stating the insecurity explicitly in an RFC in 2011, only this led to this triggered browser vendors and server developers like Apache and Nginx to actually technically ban SSL 2.0. Falling back to SSL 2.0 was no longer supported or possible. In 1996, SSL 3.0 was standardized. This already happened in RFC, and deprecated in 2015 when an attack became public that was called Poodle. But SSL 3.0 was also, we knew about better things, what we can improve, but when standard, it was so long in place because in 1999 SSL 3.0 was essentially standardized as TLS 1.0. So the differences among them are marginal, there are no dramatic changes, it's mostly on a technical level, the interoperability was ensured, and a downgrade option was enabled. So this was more like a compatibility layer, but essentially, it's not what you should use in daily practice. With TLS 1.1, well, very little has been added, and just for those who are interested, an implicit initialization vector became to an external one in order to prevent attacks on ciphers that use the CBC mode for operation. And the current standard, what we actually use, the current standard, let me emphasize this, is TLS 1.2. There is a 1.3 also, which as of 2021 is a so-called proposed standard. So it's not been standardized. There can be updates to the RFC. Most browsers nowadays support 1.3 and servers as well, but TLS 1.2 is by far more widespread as of now. There were old ciphers removed that are now known to be insecure, like ARC4, MD5, and so on. There were bug fixes to the protocol. And with TLS 1.3, this was again improved, and also regarding performance. TLS 1.3 is around for years. It should actually already be a standard for a long time, but a lot of organizations have complained about making this the new standard, like banks, for example, or organizations that use very invasive firewalls that fear that they will see less traffic or see less information about the data transferred when TLS 1.3 is used. So what can we read out about this between the lines? This means TLS 1.3 is a clear upgrade to security, it's a clear improvement, and you should in every case favor 1.3, TLS 1.3 over 1.2, especially over the older versions. We can also have a look on the distribution of versions. There's a nice overview from an organization called Qualys, and it's named SSL Pulse. They state that they monitor this on a monthly basis. In fact, the most recent update is already a few months old. But what we see is that TLS 1.2 is supported by nearly 100% of websites which we're using over TLS nowadays. SSL 2 and 3 have no noticeable market share, but a lot of servers up to 50%, 51% as of October still support TLS 1.0. And there is an upcoming race, it's upcoming trending that almost 40% of tested servers nowadays already support TLS 1.3. And of course, this race here will increase, while the others will of course decrease. So the most notable competitors, if you want so, TLS protocols are these two, with TLS 1.2 being the most prevalently supported one. So what's the purpose of TLS? The idea is that all the services that run on top of that, on top of TLS, that are integrated into the TCP/IP layers, support authentication, data integrity, and encryption. So you see here in this overview, you know the protocols HTTPS, you know FTP, you know SMTP for sending emails, IMAP for receiving emails, and there is, if TLS is used below, then there follows an S afterwards. So this is why in the browser you write HTTPS if you want an encrypted website. And the idea of all these, the combination of all these protocols with TLS, is to make sure that you, for example, your web browser, can make sure it's really speaking with the server it thinks it is. So as a practical example, you go to, how do I know with who I'm actually talking to? And if you go to the banking website, you want to be sure that you're actually on the website of your bank and not on another server, or just a website that looks as this. So authentication also means secure identity, like someone showing you a passport. And the passport we have here, the server, if the server shows you a passport, to draw this analogy, this means it shows you its certificate. Data integrity. we want to make sure that nobody can inject something. Just imagine you're making a transaction using the bank account, using a bank account, you're logged in. If there was no data integrity protection, someone could just modify the amount of data you just transferred. So this could lead to of course, this could have a dramatic impact if there was no data integrity. And we achieve data integrity with TLS by making sure that the message itself, which is encrypted also, cannot be changed. The third part is confidentiality, or in that sense, encryption. I want to make sure that to keep privacy at a high level, I want to make sure that the keys that are needed between the server and the client will not, that the attacker can never ever get these keys. And the best way to achieve this is if I never exchange the key. And the best option we have nowadays is to actually never exchange a key, but to do a key agreement. Remember, you've just heard about key agreement in the context of Diffie-Hellman. Technically, it's not necessary that all these services are supported or required. So for example, of course you could use TLS without data integrity protection, but it would introduce the chance for malleability. Someone could taint your message, modify your message, the actual one. Even if it's encrypted, someone might just, well, add some bytes, strip some bytes, and this could change a lot. Or, of course, you could also use TLS services without verifying the identity of a server. This would just mean if the browser tells you, I don't trust this service, and you click continue anyways, then you're basically just stripping this authentication part here. So you should remember these 3 points here: the authentication, data integrity, and encryption. This is the main idea. This is what TLS tries to achieve. You should know with who you're talking to, that nobody can change the messages both sides are exchanging, and the confidentiality between these 3 things, between the data exchanged, is ensured. So how does such a TLS transaction actually look like? In fact, it's not just one message you're sending, but an entire handshake that's going on there. And the idea of this handshake is to establish all the parameters that you need so that the client and the server can exchange data securely. So when you go to a website, the first thing your browser does, using HTTPS, the first thing your browser does is it will send a so-called client hello message to the server. The server most likely listens on port 443 for new connections, will receive your client hello, and then reply with a server hello message, send another message which includes a certificate, a server key exchange, and based on that the client will arrange its own key exchange, send a so-called change cipher spec, a finished, and of course the server also the server hello done. The server will again reply, and then they have negotiated. So after the point 4, we will have will have exchanged or agreed on a secure key to exchange data, application data securely. You might just wonder, well, why have I skipped the lines marked in red? What we usually do when using the web is, your browser intends to trust a server. So the server shows you its identity, and you, in the client, verify this identity. Technically, there's also another way for that, and this is called client TLS. Client TLS is just like server TLS, but the other way around. So with client TLS, the client shows a certificate to the server, and the server verifies the identity of the client. You could also, in theory, use both things, client TLS and server TLS combined, so that the server will show a certificate to the client will do so the same thing to the server. When are you using client TLS? For example, with VPNs. So very often you use a VPN and you have no username and password for that, or you have it and you need a certificate in addition. So whenever you use a VPN with certificates, you use client TLS. And the certificate you have for the VPN is like your identity. It's been generated for you, and you send it to you as a client. Your VPN client sends it to the server and says, hey, this is the identity I'd like to authenticate at you, and so please grant me access. So like a passport showing at the border. And mostly when we're just going to, I don't know, Google.com, there is no client TLS involved. It's just server-side TLS. So in other words, just the server showing you its certificate, and the client just skips the steps, or the server also skips the steps related to client TLS. So this is just the red options here are just if client TLS is used. So remember, in the regular use case, if your email program, your web browser is not using client TLS, unless you as a server owner say, I'm only allowing people to go to my website if they show me a valid certificate. And if not, then I will not. So let's have a more closer look at what happens when the client makes a connection to a web server. When it does so, it first opens a TCP connection on port 443. This is where the web server and HTTPS server usually lists, like Apache or Nginx. They usually list on port 443. The client initializes a TLS connection by sending such a client hello message, as you can see on the right. It sends a client hello message with some attributes set, like some random data, which we will need later in the handshake, and well, an optional session ID, the highest supported TLS version, a list of compression methods, a list of extensions, and the suggested cipher suite. So we will still go into detail about cipher suites, but what you should remember, what you can take out of this list, what you can immediately see is it's basically that the client shows to the server what it supports. So in this case, for example, my client told the server the highest version I'm supporting is TLS 1.2. And the list of cipher suites I'm understanding I can cope with is this list here. I'm supporting some compression methods, just one methods, and certain extensions. So you may make use of that cipher suite, of that one, and eventually of an extension. This is, so remember with HTTP, for example, there was, when you go to a website, for example, in the request header, your browser always sends, for example, whether it supports compression, the language it prefers, and so on, like some metadata. In this case, the browser or the client tells the server the TLS properties it would actually support. Of course, the first thing the server does after seeing this is it will also hello back to the client and provide a selection of what itself supports. So based on this list the client just sent, the server will pick something like the TLS version to use, this the cipher suite from the list of supported cipher suites. It will also generate a random number itself, which might be of use later on. But there's compression mechanisms it supports, the extensions, and so on. So in other words, both sides are just exchanging metadata or meta information about what they support, and some initial data which might be needed later on, like random bytes. What's important is that this is also some sort of early agreement. So if there is no match, for example, imagine this list here of cipher suites the client would send to the server would be empty. Then the handshake would just fail early with, in Firefox the error would be SSL error no cipher overlap, or in Chrome version or cipher mismatch. Just like, imagine you're using an old Android 4 phone, and old Android 4 phones unfortunately do not yet support TLS 1.2. So if you'd go to a modern server and the minimum it supports is TLS 1.2, then the communication will just end with such an error. So what follows after the server has sent this is the certificate. And remember, this is the certificate the identity the server wants to show to the client. So like the identity of google.com. And I already hinted that this is a chain. So since we're very Google, let's look at this certificate of comparison. There's a certificate chain, and the first certificate is always the server certificate itself. So the certificate issued for example, SSLLabs.com. Each following certificate must verify the preceding one. So really in the sense of a chain. And the server provides in this certificate the host name. So in our case, the example I just showed you, this is SSLLabs.com. The public key used by the server, because remember, the private key is never transferred. And the proof of a trusted third party that the owner of this host name, SSL Labs in my example, holds the private key for this public key. So why is this a chain? Because the browser, the client also has to know who issued this certificate, who signed this. So it's just, I mean, okay, this is probably again a stupid example, but I'd like to help you with the analogy. Let's say you write your password yourself. Who would trust your password? But we're deferring trust here. Instead of writing your password, you request your password from a trusted authority, a certificate authority like a Ministry of Austria, and other governments are apparently also trusting this ministry. So this leads to a trust chain. So in other words, this certificate's been issued by that one and this one by that one. And your browser trusts this certificate from DigiCert here. And as I've shown you, this certificate is issued to itself. It's even including some purpose here, what can be done with it. This is something you can request when you want the certificate to be issued, and several attributes that are within the certificates, like a serial number, a version of the certificate, the algorithm that was used for assigning the certificate, who issued this, a common name, an organization unit, an organization, the country, and from when to when it's valid. So usually these root certificates on top of a tree, they're usually very long, valid for a long time, and afterwards they will have to be replaced. This one features a public key, private key of 2048 bits. So in other words, if until 2031 RSA 2084 bits will be insecure, for example, because our computers get so strong that they can brute force this in a very short time, just like RSA with 1024 bits, then, well, this certificate will most likely be rejected or taken out from the game earlier than this date. Just as a side note. So multiple attributes here, as you can see, also the key usage like digital signature, certificate signing. So this is the purpose for which you can use the certificate. And this is also what my client here lists. A friendly name and so on. So nothing fancy, but especially the certificate for the website, this is the one we see here. It says, for example, it's valid only to April, and then it will have to be renewed. So these certificates here, by the way, the root certificates, these are called trust anchors. This is what my browser trusts. And my browser has a trust store, which it manages, and it knows that for each of these certificates that are in there, it's going to trust. So when this, for example, the certificate I trust has issued this one, and this one again has issued that one, then we have a trust chain. And my browser will trust the certificate for SSL Labs because it trusts the root certificate. And usually you do not have to send this when you're a website owner and you want to, you request a certificate, for example, for google.com. You don't necessarily have to also send the root certificate to the client because it needs to know it anyway. It needs to have it in its trust store in order to trust the certificate it just received. So if you monitor the communication in Wireshark, it will just look like this. You will see a certificate like this one here. Here we have another one following up. You see And in the first case, this is the first certificate. This one is the one actually certifying the server. This has been issued, for example, for online TU Graz IT. And yeah, the format, by the way, if you wonder what kind of format this is here, this is called ASN1 DER encoding. This is a special format that's helping us in order to structure certificates internally. And you see, for example, here, the ID or the server name that's been issued is Online TU Graz, and that's the unit it's been issued for, and the issuer is here Terina SSL High Assurance CA. Of course, this is probably not the end of the chain. There might be other certificates following up, but this is basically what happens behind the scene when you get the certificate. Another message the server sends is related to everything the client needs for key exchange. So as part of the key exchange, both client and server process certain data, and probably it will need the key pair of the other side. So it will send the other party the public key in this step. The shared encryption key will then be generated using a combination of each party's private key and the public key. So this is exactly the Diffie-Hellman procedure I showed you a few minutes ago. So if we need additional information for that, then we're sending this message. And as you can see in the screenshot here on the right, this is, for example, the meta information we need when we want to negotiate an ECDSH key. So digital signature algorithm based on elliptic curves. This is the name of the curve here, by the way, and some additional information. So in the case of server key exchange, what we're transferring here is, for example, the parameters of the curve. So both parties, client and server, will need this here so that they can generate a key that's based on the same curve. And we do not distinguish this only by the name, so we are also sending additional information. This step here happens only, remember we are now here, this step only happens in the case of client TLS. So in that case, in theory, it can be that I told you what you're usually using is that server TLS, the server shows a certificate to the client. With client TLS, it can be that only the client shows a certificate to the server, not the other way around. So after the server has sent all the data, it also indicates that it's finished with half of the handshake using a so-called server hello done message, which is fairly simple, as you can see here from the screenshot. So this is the signal for the client that the server has sent all the data. If there's a client certificate, so we're using client TLS, then this is the point where the client sends its certificate to the server. Remember, this is not the standard case. This is only when client TLS is used. But I mentioned it here explicitly because this is what's very common with VPNs, for example, that you or your client shows a certificate to the server. With what happens next, of course, is a client key exchange. So this is the analogy. We have this now with the server key exchange. The client does the same thing, but from its side. And the content, again, depends on the used cipher. So for example, if RSA is used for a key exchange, then the client generates a random encryption key, uses the server's public key to encrypt it, and sends it to the server here. If Diffie-Hellman is used, only the parameters are sent for Diffie-Hellman in order to achieve key agreement. Because remember, with Diffie-Hellman, there is no key exchange, but a key agreement. Both sides agree on a shared secret. With a third option, and that's the secure option, which is called ephemeral Diffie-Hellman, the message contains the client's Diffie-Hellman public key. So ephemeral, and we will still come back to that later on with perfect forward secrecy, only a very short living key pair is generated. But don't worry if you don't get the full context here about the differentiation between these mechanisms. There will be more on that within a few minutes. So again, this is the counterpart, what the client sends to the server. about the data the server needs to know in order to achieve key exchange. So if RSA is used for key exchange, and I'd really like to point out this is a very simple example with RSA, but it's not the secure example. But let me illustrate why, and you should understand why this is insecure, which is the reason I'm showing this example. So the first, if RSA is used for key exchange, the client first generates a so-called pre-master secret. So essentially this is just 48 random bytes, and it uses the public key included in the server certificate to encrypt this. It sends it to the server, and the server will then just use its private key to decrypt the pre-master secret. So in other words, the client has just exchanged a key with the server. It sent the server the key it wants to use for communication, for encrypted communication. The next step, there's a master secret, which is the so-called session key that's been derived by the server and the client. And to achieve that, they're just using the random nonces that were exchanged in the initial client hello and server hello messages. So the pre-master secret is always something like a secret before the real master secret. And the master secret is also always 48 bytes, which is why a lot of people, cannot differentiate between these two keys. They appear to be the same, but no, in between there is still the transmission of the pre-master secret to the server. So what do we have here? The client generates a secret, sends it to the server, encrypts it using the proper key. The server decrypts it using private key. This is asymmetric cryptography, the plain form of asymmetric cryptography. Well, that's very handy, isn't it? The problem is there is some fundamental weaknesses. Because anyone who has access to the private key of the server can recover the pre-master secret. So even if you, for example, you do not know the server's private key right now, well, imagine I'm a law enforcement agency. I just could contact the server owner with a warrant and say, or the data center and say, give me access to the server, I'd like to retrieve that RSA private key. And imagine they have sniffed the traffic, which you have the data traffic, you have the previous communication with a certain server, then they could use the RSA key to just decrypt all the previous communication. Why? Because they would just say, well, the client hello or the server hello are not encrypted yet, so they have the random numbers here to derive the master secret, and as soon as someone has this RSA key, you can just go back the whole way. You can decrypt the pre-master secret, use the two randoms here, and you will get back to the master secret. And the master secret or a session key, you can actually decrypt data. So bottom line, when RSA is used for key exchange, it all comes down to the security of the private RSA key. Whoever has the private RSA key, no matter at what point in time, for example, even if the communication was already 3 months ago, it's still possible to decrypt all the data communication with a server client. An alternative, which is usually considered more secure, is based on Diffie-Hellman. But with Diffie-Hellman, you can use different parameters. This is something I've shown you here. So with Diffie-Hellman, for example, here we have the server, for example, has the client appearance. It should use for elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. If these parameters are not chosen wisely, for example, using Diffie-Hellman with a very insecure finite group, then it can still be insecure. So if the server sends the client insecure parameters, session security can still be impaired. So in order to, as a compromise or to prevent this, the solution is to use standardized domain parameters. So in other words, you only use finite groups with Diffie-Hellman that are considered to be secure, or you're using elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman parameters with ephemeral keys. But we'll come to that with perfect forward secrecy later on anyway. So what's the gist of this slide? RSA is simple, but this is not the standard case. Please remember this for the exam. This is considered insecure. I explicitly point this out anyway because you should be aware this is still supported. This is still possible, but if you find a server doing this, it is insecure. Not technically, because as long as nobody has the private key, you're all fine. But as soon as someone gets the private key, all the previous communication can be decrypted, and the current one of course also. And future ones, if only RSA is supported. So it's all bound to the private key with RSA security. With Diffie-Hellman, security depends on chosen parameters. With client TLS, there is again this client certificate verify step where the client also proves to the server that it actually possesses the private key that belongs to the server, to the client certificate. This is important because otherwise I could just sniff the certificate which was transferred in this step here and then pretend to be that client. So in this step, I have to show to the server that I also own the private key for that, and only then the server will trust it. Another message that's on both sides is the change cipher spec. It's essentially very short and just says, yeah, we have now everything for key exchange, key exchange, and we can switch to encrypted data transfer. So with this message, the client indicates that it has calculated the shared encryption keys and that all the following messages will be encrypted. To verify that the handshake was successful and not tampered with, the client calculates verification data and encrypts it with the public key from the server. So this way, this verification data is built from all the previous handshake messages. In other words, everything that's been transferred before, all the messages are now encrypted and using the server's public key. And this phase, so this is to verify this is sent to the other side and to make sure that nobody tampered with the handshake in between. So the server basically says, hey, this is the messages I got from you, and the server, by receiving an encrypted message, it should see, well, yeah, this is really the messages I've sent. So nobody interfered with that. So this already happens encrypted. Summary, just to make it more visible if you yourself go this through, because I mentioned a lot of details with all the individual steps. What happens here with the handshake is the client starts the handshake, sends the parameters it supports, for example, what cipher suits your browser supports, the highest supported TLS version to the server. The server chooses or picks some connection parameters, hopefully secure ones. It sends its certificate change, if needed for key exchange, also some additional parameters. So whenever there is Diffie-Hellman or ephemeral elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman used, for example, there's always this server key exchange step. Then just a message to the client, yeah, server hello done. The client does the same thing. It sends its parameters for key exchange to the server. They switch to encrypted communication and make sure that nobody tainted with the handshake in between. By sending a checksum to the other side, it's verified, yeah, nobody really interfered, and that's it. So, may seem like a lot, but it's not. The record itself, the messages that are then transferred, if you, for example, transfer regular TLS data after the handshake, is fairly simple. It's all what you see on the screenshot. So there's a content type so that the next layer knows what it's actually transferring. There is a version, as usual with network protocols, the length of the payload, the message authentication code to preserve integrity. So using this MAC here, this serves like a checksum to make sure that what follows here after the header, the actual payload, has not been modified. And eventually, if we're using block ciphers, it might be necessary that all our messages have a certain size. The size, a block size that's used by the cipher to encrypt data, and therefore we would have to potentially pad the header here to exactly come to these 16 bytes or whatever block size your cipher is using. The actual data, which follows here afterwards, is encrypted using the master secret. So the master secret here is either the secret using RSA, which please do not use that, it's insecure, or the shared secret. Both parties have agreed upon using some form of Diffie-Hellman. So if I say do not use RSA, well, sometimes you have no chance. And if you'd use that here, if there would be RSA, your browser would still trust that connection. You wouldn't notice, you can't defer to the browser and to say, well, if this is RSA, well, my browser should figure it out himself if this is secure or not. It will not, it will trust the communication because the communication itself is not insecure. But the risk is that someone unauthorized, some third party will ever get hold of the private RSA key, and then all the communication of the past, the current, and the future can be decrypted. So that's what makes this practically insecure and not recommendable in practice. Now, besides the handshake, there are certain attributes that are exchanged between server and client. And I already told you this, you have seen it in the very beginning in the handshake with the client hello and the server hello. There was a list of cipher suites that the client sent to the server, and the server picked one of them. So these cryptographic aspects that are actually to be used during this handshake and during this TLS connection, they are enclosed within such a cipher suite. So the cipher suite defines for example, how to build an encryption key when doing the key exchange, or what algorithm it should use to verify the identity of the server. So in other words, do the authentication. The algorithm it should use to calculate a checksum when making sure the integrity is preserved for transferred messages, or also what algorithm to actually use to encrypt the data you actually transfer using TLS. So all these algorithms here are embedded in this so-called cipher suite, and they all these algorithms make sure that you ensure that you get authenticity, integrity, and confidentiality. So during the key agreement, to achieve this too, to integrity and confidentiality, we need a key exchange. And as already hinted, this is what you find in such a cipher suite string. The general structure is always the same. So usually it starts with the protocol, which is always TLS. Sorry. In some references, you still see that it says SSL TLS here. But, well, you know that from a few slides ago that usually we do not use SSL 2.0 and 3.0 anymore. So this protocol the prefix here will always be TLS. So at first it will always stand TLS. Then the first argument here will refer to the key exchange. So this will be sorry. This will be the algorithm to use for key exchange. Then followed by that the algorithm for authentication, the block cipher or the cipher to encrypt our data with, so not the header but the actual TLS payload, and the message authentication, the algorithm to calculate the message authentication code. So for example here, SHA-256. And if you ever look for that, there are different notation forms. So the most common, the most prevalent one is the Diana form, where all these arguments are separated by these underscores in big letters. It will read like this. In other cases, you will also see, for example, such a notation, or the polar SSL notation will be this one here. So the RSA here of authentication will always refer to the certificate. So if we get a certificate from a server and it's been signed using RSA, for example, I think it was this one here. Let's see. Details. Yeah, it was signed using RSA. Includes an RSA public key, was signed using the signature. Where was it? Here. So first there was a checksum derived from the algorithm using SHA-256, and then RSA was used to sign a certificate. So in the cipher suite, the server that we are using here was it here? So in the cipher suite, yeah, we're using TLS 1.3 here. This is the argument for key exchange, and this is the block cipher we're using. I don't see the authentication here, but this would mean here, if let's say from this website here, we would have something like this here with AES-128 GCM, our authentication RSA, and key exchange using X25519. But yeah, this is an elliptic curve. So the key exchange would also be ECDS HE. So in other words, for this website, we would have exactly such a cipher suite. So unfortunately, Chrome doesn't show this in more detail. I think Firefox does, but I don't have it installed here. Yeah, don't worry, we'll come to that later on anyway. I'll show it to you in examples. So let's quickly have a look at more details on these key exchange. So the key exchange field here can either be Diffie-Hellman, it can also be Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, or counterpart, instead of finite groups, you'd base this on the key agreement based on elliptic curves, and then there would be ECDH, so EC in the beginning. This usually if you're out for performance, you should use the ECDH variants over the regular Diffie-Hellman variants because they're just faster. So instead of a multiplication, exponentiation, and finite groups, you do a point addition on elliptic curves. This is just by performance faster. And the resulting key will also be smaller. So ECDH keys based on elliptic curves, if you compare them, for example, if you use a regular Diffie-Hellman, you'd, for example, a Diffie-Hellman key with 1024 bits would correspond to an ECDH key with 160 bits. So the key is just smaller. It needs less to transfer, less bytes, and this would again equal around an 80 byte symmetric key. So I know this sounds 2012 seems rather old, but this is actually still in place since then. So that's just for comparison. So whenever you can, or what's advisable from a performance point of view and a security point of view, would be to use elliptic curves over the static Diffie-Hellman. And there is also an E here, which refers to ephemeral. In the slides so far, you have seen the word ephemeral 3 times. So here 2 times, and once again a few slides back. Ephemeral means short-living, and we'll come to that later. But in the context of perfect forward secrecy, this plays a very important role. Just as a hint or a teaser, I want to give you the information in pieces. not all at once. So just as a hint, don't worry if you can't handle ephemeral as of now, you will be able to understand it later on. If you want to know what cipher suite your system supports, for example, in any Linux or Mac-based OS, you can enter OpenSSL cipher suite. And since modern systems usually rely on or include OpenSSL, you will see a list of the ciphers your system supports. So this is like the baseline of, for example, using Firefox on Linux. Then it will go back to it will reach out to the OpenSSL library installed on your system. And OpenSSL will offer the use of any of these ciphers to your browser. So any of these ciphers can then be used in a browser. And you see that these ciphers have different security properties. So for example, in one case, see here again, we have another notation. This is the OpenSSL notation here. This, for example, this cipher could be used with TLS 1.2. The key exchange would be ECDH. Authentication, so the verification of the other side's identity, would be done using RSA. The encryption of the actual data would happen via ACE-GCM, 256-bit. And to make sure that the integrity of the data is preserved, there would be a special mode called authenticated encryption data. So the authentication, the integrity would actually already be included in cipher. But you could also do the same thing. You could also use SHA-1 for that. So that's just a property of the cipher where the integrity protection is already given by the encryption cipher. So you see there's a variety, and your browser will send such a list, probably not all of them, but at least a selection of that to the server. And the server, if well configured, will choose the most secure variant the browser offered. There's, by the way, the list will continue, so if you want to see more, then have a look at this link. So what cipher suite your browser offers to a server, for example, depends on the browser used. So it can be that, for example, the communication to a server is secured differently whether you use Chrome or Firefox. Why? Because these two browsers, and actually all the browsers, are relying on different libraries to retrieve these cipher suites from, and also to do encryption with. So for example, Microsoft Edge is using the cryptography service provider, or in short CSP, that's included in the Windows operating system. The Mozilla Firefox relies on a library called Network Security Services, or NSS in short. And if I'm not mistaken, Google actually came up with this library. Chrome then reused it, repurposed it for their own needs with adaptations. So Apple, of course, as always, has their own development. They're using a library called Secure Transport. And on Android, again, the situation is different. So for example, there you usually use a stripped version of the Bouncy Castle library or the Android OpenSSL library if your app, for example, reaches out to a server via TLS. So bottom line is, depending on what browser you use, a different library is chosen under the hood. This has some security implications, some severe security implications, because this means the security of your connection does not only depend on the server and the cipher it will choose, but it also depends on the client, the browser version, the library in the back, and the security can even for the whole connection. So if you, for example, as a server owner say, I'm not allowing Arc4, I'm not allowing any connections that use Arc4 as a stream cipher to be used, for example, instead of AES. This will automatically cause that no more computers can communicate with your server that are using Windows XP. Well, you may think Windows XP is outdated for already a long time, so that won't do any harm. That's true. But since, for example, a lot of banking terminals, if you go to an ATM, they are still running Windows XP or a customized version of Windows XP. If you do that there, you might have a problem. So if they're also communicating with servers, and apparently these servers have to be configured to allow still such insecure communication. So what your browser supports can be found with a website, for example, like howsmyssl.com, and depending on the browser you're using, it will show you, for example, the highest version it supports, whether it supports ephemeral keys, whether it's vulnerable to certain attacks, whether it does not offer communication over insecure ciphers, and the list of cipher suites it offers to the server. So in the client hello step, my browser sent these cipher suites to this server, and then the server picked one. They're just analyzing the handshake and showing what my browser sent. So just to pick one for example, like in this case here, key exchange and authentication is achieved via RSA. This is exactly the case I previously told you this is insecure. But you see, I've now here the newest Chrome version, it's still offering this cipher suite. Could we block this, or why is this still offered by Chrome? Well, because there are still servers out there which don't support anything better than that, like this thingy here. So this is still for legacy or compatibility reasons enabled. And when stating it's insecure, then keep in mind it's not that RSA itself insecure. The problem is more that if someone gets hold of the server's private key, for example, some federal agency with a search warrant or something, so all security is bound to just the server's private key. These mechanisms are, by the way, they refer to TLS 1.3. So if you're curious about what your browser can, then have a look at this site. And I promise you, the output will be different on depending on what browser you use. So if you have multiple browsers installed, try to see on what cipher suites they support. So just to hint that this is exactly what I just said. If you use, for example, Facebook with Chrome, then it will say, I'm supporting TLS 1.3. For we're using elliptic curve defilement for key exchange, and the elliptic curve to be used will be X25519. The block cipher used to encrypt the actual data will be AES 128 bits with the GCM mode. With Firefox, it's essentially the same choice, but this is just a coincidence. It could also differ. So this is really depending on what the browser supports and offers the server to connect with. Now something I've already hinted, but not explained in full. So this brings us back to where I say there is some word called ephemeral. So perfect verbal secrecy is not a story attached to that. The problem, and this is exactly what I've now repeated a few times about RSA, is that this RSA private and public key is usually a long-term key. So whoever gets hold of this key can decrypt all the past sessions. So let's say you're capturing traffic via Wireshark, you have no key for that, and you cannot decrypt this in the very moment. But whenever this, for example, a server is insecure, it's getting hacked and someone steals the private key, or there's a search warrant, as I already said, and someone ever gets to this private RSA key, it will be possible for this third party to decrypt previously confidential information. Why? Because, just to reiterate on that, the security is bound to the fact that the client generates random bytes, generates a pre-master secret, encrypts it with the server with the RSA public key, sends it to the server. And based on that, the server decrypts it, then they agree on the master secret using the random data from the client hello and the server hello. So I hope this different styles I explained this makes it even more clear why you should not use RSA for that. So what happens in a more visual way? The client sends a client hello. The client offers, for example, the cipher suite, this one here, and this is probably the newest or the best one the client supports. So eventually, you have an old client, you have an old Android phone, and the old Android phone just doesn't support anything better. Then it might be the cipher suite it offers to the server, and the server will say, well, if there's no alternative to that, let's go for that. So the server will reply and say, yeah, we're using this cipher suite. And here you see if you see a cipher suite where the RSA follows after the TLS, this means RSA is used for key exchange and authentication. In other words, this is exactly the key exchange I warn you about. What it also sends after the server hello is the certificate, including the public key. Of course, what the client does next, as already stated, it generates its session key, it encrypts it using the public key from the server certificate, it sends it to the server takes the private key, decrypts it, and they both go to the master secret using concatenation in the pseudo-random function, and that's it. So precisely, the secret was really exchanged, in other words, transferred from the client to the server. And all the security is bound to this long-term keys here. So what the server has installed, it has a certificate to offer to the client. This certificate includes a public RSA key, and the server has a private RSA key. Well, probably never should actually leave the server, that should never be seen by someone else. But what if someone actually gets hold of this private RSA key? So this was a very imminent threat. For example, if you think of Edward Snowden, he used an email provider called LavaBit, and LavaBit actually relied on such long-term keys. The NSA apparently sniffed the communication between LavaBit and Snowden, but they could not decrypt it because they did not have the keys. So they sent a national security letter to LavaBit, the email provider, and requested the handout of this private RSA key. Now, LavaBit had two options, and they opted for the second one. The first one was giving out the key. The second was shutting down the services. That's exactly what they did in order for NetVent not to have handed out the keys. The better choice here is to make use of perfect forward secrecy. Perfect forward secrecy is based on key agreement, which means the key is never actually exchanged, it's never actually transferred. You're using a shared secret. You agree on a key, both sides agree on a key, and I transfer small parts that are needed to compute the key, but never the full key. And it works exactly like this. The server first generates a short-living Diffie-Hellman key pair. Short-living here, or ephemeral in technical term, means it's destroyed after the TLS session ends. So the idea is that this key pair will not be stored in a server for a long time. In other words, imagine, for example, the server is shut down, the server is busted, the server owner is busted by the police, then this key pair of all the previous communication should no longer exist. And for that, to generate this key pair, this Diffie-Hellman key pair, there are two possible mechanisms. Either you use the regular Diffie-Hellman on finite groups, or you use Diffie-Hellman on elliptic curves. And in both cases, when such a short-living key pair is generated, we denote this using this trailing E. So this is a common mistake in exams, that people think the E here, at first, the first letter here, this stands for ephemeral. No, it's always the trailing one. And it stands for ephemeral. In other words, the server knows it will have to throw away this key pair after the TLS session has ended. So the server just generated such a key pair. It signs it using the public key. It signs the public key of this Diffie-Hellman key pair with the private key from the server certificate. Depending on the certificate, this can be RSA or ECDSA, whatever signature scheme you use here. That's not really important what algorithm you use for signing, as long as the algorithm is secure. The client receives the signed public Diffie-Hellman key, and if the server used its private key to sign it, then the client meanwhile has also received the public key encapsulated in the server certificate. It can use it, this public key, to check if the signature is verifiable. In other words, if the signed public key it just got from the server is really from the server. So what happens here is key agreement. Or more visually, to make this more transparent, it's not that the client is generating the session key alone. The server and the client agree on a mutual secret, on a shared secret. So when using Diffie-Hellman ephemeral, or the same thing on elliptic curves, there is still a private RSA and a public RSA key embedded in the certificate, but they are used for different purposes. So again, this is the handshake that happens in such a perfect forward secrecy scenario. The client sends a clientele to the server replies, but in this case now the client offers a cipher suite that supports ephemeral key pairs. This E here is important. And the server picks such a cipher suite, like in this case here, this one here. And of course, since the client again, the server certificate that includes the public key. So remember, just in case it was not obvious enough, the certificate includes, this is the signature algorithm that was used. There is a signature in there, and there is a public key in there. In this case, for example, on this page, in this page, that's cool, because we're using an ECDSA key, so most likely this one here. Remember here, for example, when I wasn't on that side, the signature scheme was RSA. The public key included in the certificate was also RSA. And the issues key, I think, was also RSA. So it was all on, So the server used the private 2048-bit key to sign the client certificate here. So, coming back to the example. The client offered support for the cipher suite to the server picked the cipher suite, replied to the client with that, and the client, followed by that, when receiving this, generates an ephemeral ECDH key pair. So it generates a public-private key pair for use with Diffie-Hellman that it will throw away after this TLS session has ended. The server does the same thing, but it also signs the public key of this key pair using the private RSA key. So it signs it, really, it does not encrypt it, it signs it and it sends it, the signed public key, to the client. This client uses the public key it received beforehand within the server certificate to verify, okay, this is really coming from the server, and sends its own public key to the server. Now, Remember the mixing color example from the very beginning with Diffie-Hellman. At this point now, Diffie-Hellman is used on both sides to link. Please note this is just a symbol. This is not a real addition, but you use Diffie-Hellman here on the client and the server side, and the client uses its own private ECDH key, the one it generated here. It mixes it with the server's public key, and based on that, key agreement is done, a shared secret is derived. On the server side, the server again also uses its own private ECDH key and the client's public key. So what's the crucial difference to the RSA example? Why is this now secure? Because the private key that belongs to the certificate on the server side here is only used to sign the short-living public key. The private key of the server certificate here, the private RSA key, is never involved in any kind of data encryption. It's only used for signing. That's important here. So it's not related to the encryption of the communication itself. And after this communication terminates, after the TLS communication ends again, the server hopefully throws away its public, these ephemeral key pair, and the client does so as well. Of course, the RSA key will remain the same, but that's it basically. So whenever someone says, for example, yeah, hand me out the RSA key, then these keys will no longer be there. And this is what makes this secure. So in other words, for every new session, the client and the server generate new Diffie-Hellman key parameters. And if they would be compromised in this very moment, then the attacker could only decrypt the current session, the one that's currently active. The key pair, the ephemeral key pair that the server and the client still have not yet destroyed. What could we also do? We could, of course, attack the session key itself, this shared secret here. But if the parameters for that are chosen securely, if you do not rely on, let's say, insecure elliptic curves or small insecure finite groups with Diffie-Hellman, if you're using only DHE, not ECDHE, then brute force should not be possible. This means, for example, you should use at least 2048 bits or stronger Diffie-Hellman groups with safe primes. If you do that, then it's computationally today still expensive or very expensive to brute force such a session key. You could also extract or attack the server in order to get hold of the private RSA key or private ECC key, depending on what you use here. This could also be ECC. But remember, with perfect format secrecy, this private server key, the long-term key, this is what we call the long-term key, because it remains there after the long-term keys, it's a key pair here, the long-term keys. They are session independent. They were there before the session, the client made the session, and they will be there after the client and the server have ended their session. So these are long-term keys. But since these long-term keys are only used to sign, the private key is only used to sign the public key pair here, attacking this key, well, it would not compromise past sessions because an attacker could not get hold of these short-living key pairs here. That's the crucial thing. And if the server is actually hacked, if an attacker has access to the server, well, then connection security is actually impaired. Why? Because the current session will then exist on the server, still exist on the server. The attacker could exfiltrate it, and of course also for all the subsequent key pairs the server generates, the attacker, if he has access to the server, can also raid. But luckily, or the good thing is, this make sure that past communication cannot be compromised. One side note here, since I say it will hopefully be deleted after the session, after the communication has ended. Well, there is a feature in TLS that's using session IDs that probably remind you in the structure of cookies, but very often if servers use session IDs, then they will keep this key pair here for some time, probably an hour or so. So not for each really physical TCP connection a new key pair is generated. Sometimes this key pair is reused if, for example, in that case the client would send a session ID to the server, and then there will be session resumption. The server will just continue with that data. The client also has it. So in other words, usually in practice there is a cache on both sides, some sort of cache where both sides remember the secret they were just communicating with. So not each new TCP connection leads to a new ephemerally negotiated shared secret. So usually there's a reuse, but of course the lifetime of this cache on both sides needs to be low, like 1 hour or so, or I don't know, no more than 12 hours. Otherwise, if the lifetime would be, I don't know, a year or so, then the server would again remember all these key pairs, which we do not want, because then they would not be ephemeral, or in other words, short-living. So how do you get this perfect fault secrecy? For a server to support it, it needs to be used at least TLS 1.2. Why? Because these cipher suites, which you have seen here, supporting ephemeral Diffie-Hellman, they've just been added with TLS 1.2. So if a server uses TLS 1.1, these cipher suites can just not be used yet. So TLS 1.2 is the minimum here. And a variety of cipher suites. So for example, my browser here supports ephemeral Diffie-Hellman key exchange based on elliptic curves, with a variety of other algorithms for authentication with ECDH. It's the block cipher and the MAC here. It also supports RSA for authentication. So remember, this is just our authentication here means just this is the algorithm used to verify who signed your certificate. This is not used for key exchange. So the crucial part with perfect fault secrecy is key exchange. RSA is not bad when used for authentication. It's only bad when used like this here for, this one is used for authentication and key exchange, which makes it unfavorable. So only these kind of, apparently my browser does not send regular non-elliptic curve suites anymore. It only sends this kind of suites to the server. But if you're curious and you want to test which cipher suites, for example, your browser supports, your phone supports, I promise you your phone will again support probably even another TLS version, other cipher suites for sure. So if you're curious what cipher suites a server supports, how secure the communication is to a server, you can use, for example, a service from Qualys, and this is not the only one. There are also others from Test SSH, for example, which is a Python script you can run on your own computer to test this. And you can say, for example, I'm testing my browser, and it will check, for example, what my browser supports. I see here my Chrome, which is recent, supports only TLS 1.3 and 2. Older versions have already been disabled because apparently Google thinks that this should not be used by servers anyway. The green cipher suites here are annotated with forward secrecy, or just forward secrecy, which means, as you can read out here, they all have an E here, which represents the ephemeral key exchange. And some of these cipher suites, like these here, this is just dummy cipher suite. These three here, they were introduced with TLS 1.3. With TLS 1.3, there is only forward secrecy, so there is no alternative to that. So they just stripped this away. So this doesn't mean that this has no forward secrecy. It just means This is a TLS 1.3 cipher suite. With TLS 1.3, this has been all still improved even. And as you can see, my browser also supports weak cipher suites. Not fully insecure, but well, cryptographically weak cipher suites. Like this RSA key exchange. So why is this considered weak? Well, exactly the scenario we had there. Why is Chrome not blocking this? Because there might be still servers out there which do not support anything better than that. As you notice, here we have a cipher suite, or this one here, which is, well, it just uses RSA for authentication and ECDH, an ephemeral key exchange using the Hellman elliptic curves. Why is this weak? The answer is it's using, so CPC is not really recommended because it falls for padding oracle attacks, and the SHA here stands for SHA-1. And as you might have heard, SHA-1, this hashing algorithm, is, well, researchers have found collisions and it's no longer considered secure. So if you, for example, use SHA-1, like in this case, if there's only SHA, then it stands for SHA-1. Only SHA-256 is present SHA-256, SHA-256. If there's just SHA, that stands for SHA-1. This means if there's a collision in such a hashing algorithm, it's possible that, for example, an attacker might craft another message, even if it's encrypted, might find another message where tiny parts are changed, but the MAC checksum is still the same. So this is what a collision is in a hash function, and SHA-1 is vulnerable to that. So it's highly unlikely this happens, which is why it just stays weak, not completely insecure with a red letter, red font, but yeah, it's definitely not the best option you can go for. And among the better options you can go for, you can trust, are these. So bottom line, what this brings us to is also that what you should realize by now is whenever you see a lock icon here, it doesn't mean the communication, your communication with a server is always equally secure. What's behind the scenes is actually a cipher suite, and some of them are cryptographically weaker than others, or probably even insecure. So this is the client part. What this website also features, you can test your server. You can test, for example, online TU-Graal.at if you entered hostname here, or what I've just done for the sake of fun, I entered TC TU-Graal.at and it will show you what this server supports. The rating this page awarded to TC TU-Graal, to the Teach Center, is B. The best would be A+. And apparently the rating was dropped vastly because of the protocol support, because it's still supporting TLS 1.0, 1.1. The orange or yellow thingy here means it's not completely insecure, but it's considered weak by modern standards. It's not something you should favor, but probably TC TU-Graal is still supporting this for legacy reasons, or that older browsers can also access the Teach Center. So what it also shows, it shows the certificate that's been sent by the server. So there's a certificate with, this is the subject, so that's it. Apparently requested such a certificate from a certificate authority. The certificate authority is this one here. They issued this. So first there was a SHA-384 hash calculated on the request, and then the certificate authority signed the certificate using RSA and included a signature in the certificate. So this is exactly what happens here. And then when I'm connected to the server, what you get the whole chain of certificates. You will also get, the server will, TC TU-Graal will also send you this certificate and that certificate and that certificate. Oh, and actually this certificate is one that we know, one that our browser trusts, apparently. So among TLS 1.3 and 1.2, the server also allows communications via these protocols that are considered weak by modern standards, and in addition, it supports by far more weak ciphers. So I guess you can, if you compare this with the list of what my browser supports and has sent to would send to a server, would offer a server, there are by far more algorithms that are considered secure, like this one here again. We have this one with SHA, a lot of them with RSA for key exchange authentication. And as already said, most likely or usually by modern standards, there are just two reasons why servers would offer you communication over weak ciphers. First, because server admins are ignorant, they just don't care. Second option, because they want to maintain compatibility with a maximum of clients. So as you can see, for example, this site also tested connectivity with different clients, and among them you see modern ones, of course, like Firefox, Chrome, and so on. And you see that all the modern clients, they all go for TLS 1.3, TLS 1.3, or even if you use, for whatever God knows reason, Firefox with Windows 7, then you'd still end up with forward secrecy and TLS 1.2. So, or if you're using, for whatever reason, still Java 6, or a very old Android phone with Android 4. I think Android 4 has a market share of less than 5% now, if even 2%. Then even Android 4 devices or lower can connect on TCP or Ground CT. So if I'd be the server admin, I'd probably just make, I'd see what browsers my users are using. And if I never see that any Android device with such a version is connecting, I'd probably just cut the line here, draw and say, no, I'm only going to support secure ciphers, so only the TLS 1.3 ciphers that are secure, and the ones with TLS 1.2. Just as a side note, so feel free to test whatever server you like. This is not an attack. This kind of attack, well, it tests for certain attacks, but more on attacks next time. It tests for certain properties here, but feel free to enter any host name you feel interested in, like your bank, for example. It just simulates different browsers and tries to make a connection with the server. And you see from this dashboard here, for example, I don't know, but just picking this one here, this seems to be related to the government of Brazil. Caixa apparently refers to some bank. So apparently they are offering insecure cipher suites. They are vulnerable to an attack called logjam, which we'll hear about next time. They are supporting very weak Diffie-Hellman parameters, and even 512 bits export suites. Server does not mitigate attacks. So this is like a negative example overall. Let's have a look at what, so this is what a negative example looks like. With a really truly negative example, you should be worried about if you're using, for example, if you test your banking website or any website you feel security should be there, and you see something like this, then you should truly be worried, because if there's a key negotiated using such an expert cipher, then even if there is an ephemeral Diffie-Hellman used for that, then the key is so small, it's just 512 bits, and you can easily brute force this in place. So we know this for almost 10 years, that such expert ciphers, if a key is generated with such a low bit size, with DS40, which is insecure as hell, then you can very easily brute force the key, which is just 40 yeah, 40 bytes. So apparently this server, for example here, this is flagged insecure because to encrypt the actual data, it's using OC4, the stream cipher OC4, and for integrity protection MD5. But MD5 in terms of collisions is even worse than SHA-1. So with SHA-1 it still takes you longer to find collisions. With MD5 this can be done on each regular computer. So this is long outdated and should never ever use such a cipher suite. But if you have a browser that's offering that cipher suite to the server, it will happily agree to it and use it insecurely. So just from the name here, this is just an assumption. I don't know this page. Just saw it now randomly in this dashboard. This seems to be Caixa means cash or bank basically. So this apparently seems related to some governmental branch of some financial aspect of the Brazilian government. Oh, and something I missed. So this is something you just heard. If you look for Online Team Grozzity, Online Team Graz is supporting good ciphers, is providing you with forward secrecy, but feel free to try. Something else I wanted to show you is how your browser will react if you go to badssl.com if it encounters pages that are insecure or servers that are insecure. So with insecure Diffie-Hellman low bit size, for example, just like the Brazilian page we just saw, the version will be, the message will be which one you see, version or cipher mismatch. Why? Because the server only supports these weak Diffie-Hellman groups, these weak Diffie-Hellman parameters, but my browser does not. So you saw it in the list here previously when I tested my browser. Such a weak cipher with 512 was not among the available ones in this list, so my browser will just not be able to connect to that, but that would be insecure. And yeah, there are multiple other tests. You can try, for example, you can go for the good ones, but you can also see what errors your browser would throw with, for example, when communication of HTTPS and HTTP is mixed. Oh, okay, this works apparently. What else do we have? OC4, which is also insecure as hell. Apparently my browser does not allow such a communication. You can simulate a man-in-the-middle attack. My browser will detect it and will see someone's trying to steal your information. Unfortunately, you can still, many pages you can then say proceed anyway. In this case, I cannot. My browser does not allow me to do this because there is a feature enabled which says the website uses HSTS. So this is like the protection to make sure that the user cannot accidentally say, I'd like to continue anyway. And the purpose of HSTS is to make sure that you always stay on a HTTPS version and never fall back to the HTTP version. But let's have a closer look on that. Very often attacks are based on downgrades from HTTPS to HTTP. So an attacker would just try to bring you to the HTTP version where there would be no session key to brute force, where there would be no, the actual communication would be just plain data that could be easily sniffed. And although a lot of communication is meanwhile using HTTPS, a lot of web pages still offer both variants, HTTPS and HTTP. So usually there's a redirect to HTTPS version, but not always. And sometimes you can also force a fallback to HTTP. So if an attacker actually manages to do this, he can inject, for example, HTTP links, rewrite links of an insecure page, and make sure that the user will never upgrade, will never see an HTTPS version. Second variant is the web page offers HTTPS only, but the attacker performs a man-in-the-middle attack and shows this website, which is actually HTTPS, using HTTP. So to the user, it will just seem, well, this website is using HTTP, and the user doesn't really see that there is an HTTPS version also. The mechanism we know to prevent such kind of attacks is called HTTP strict transport security, or in short, stay on the HTTPS version as always or only as possible as you can. And it works in the way that the server, the web server, sends a specific HTTP header to the client and instructs it to remember this, to remember for a certain time frame, like this max H here, to remember that a certain website must only be called via HTTPS. So for that, if for example I go to, well, let's probably this one, let's figure it out. I haven't tried it beforehand. Let's say I'm calling the developer tools, reloading the page. Now this is a list of queries the browser has sent to the server. So this is what the request headers my browser sent to this page. In the response, there was an HTTP header that stated strict transport security for this amount of seconds and something in addition. So what this causes, and this is not related to the certificate at all, so please do not think that the browser remembers the certificate. This is an error. I can't explain where this comes from, but very often in exams people think, or people state, that the browser remembers the certificate. No, it does not. It just remembers that this page should be called via HTTPS only for the amount of seconds indicated here. And there's another thing, something you can include here, it's called include subdomains. And it does what the name says. So it tells the browser to not only call, for example, howsmyssl.com via HTTPS, but also all the subdomains in case there are any, like www or ASDF or whatever you want. So if the browser sees something like this, with include subdomains, it will remember that this also applies to subdomains. Now imagine that TU Graz.at would send something like this. If it would include this up to the point here, then your browser would remember that to call this for this amount of seconds, this website only via HTTPS. And it would refuse connections over HTTP for that amount of time. If the TU Graz server would also send this here, then our browser would know that it must only call TC TU Graz.at and online TU Graz.at also over HSTS. And of course you can also specify this header for subdomains. It's not necessarily only the parent domain. You can specify this header wherever you want, and the browser will remember it. But it's not related to the certificate at all. So see, this is the HTTP header. This is, I'm getting back an HTTP response with such a header, and then my browser will remember this to say, oh, whenever the user enters or whenever this URL should be called, then only over HTTPS. Now, there is something missing, and this actually prevents so-called SSL stripping attacks, which you will hear more about next time. But what if the browser never sees this header here? So what if an attacker already strips this before the browser has seen this at all? So if the browser, for example, would first go to a website and then the attacker would just already strip the header, then the browser would never see the header. And to prevent this attack scenario, there is another flag which is called preload. And you've seen it here. It says preload in the end. And if a server sends this, then this is the sign that this URL can be included in a so-called preloaded list. This is like a regular list Let's see. Yeah. So here's a list. This is basically just regular domain, yeah. But I can enter house my SSL. I think it was how my SSL. House my. Oh, cool. They actually made a mistake in configuring. So the idea of this page, yeah, and this is the max age for 10 years. They made a mistake. Okay, before explaining the mistake, let me first clarify what this is. This list here, or this service here, allows you to enter a domain name, and if the domain name in the HTTP response sends such a preload flag, then browsers will, whenever, for example, there's a Firefox update or Chrome update, then the browser update will also introduce an updated list. And this is just a list of host names, a static list where your browser knows I should always call this page over HTTPS. I might not be surprised, for example, if Google is in this list. No, they're not, because of the redirect. Oh, and they do not enforce HTTPS. What other domain is there? I don't know. Let's try it out. Nope. OFT was another example. They do not even enable HSTS. There is no header at all. Or is there? Microsoft? No. So you see, this is a security mechanism, and its purpose or its need actually seems pretty obvious. But I've not just randomly tried some domains, and you see, they all failed these requirements. No HSTS header. Or something misconfigured. What does it mean? It means that this attack, this SSL stripping attack, what an attacker can do is actually possible. But the thing is, to prevent that an attacker has control over the initial requests, so that an attacker cannot just strip away this header, we can include a page in this preloaded list. But therefore, it needs to ship such a well-formed header. And only if this is the case, then browsers will actually ship a list with that domain name. So this prevents, this is also called trust on first use. So that you have trust on first use, so that the browsers will already go to website via HTTPS before they even made a connection once to that site. This preload thingy here needs to be active. Why? Because if you go to, for example, I specify here now OFT, just for the sake of demonstration, what will my browser try? Will it try HTTP or HTTPS? We will end up at the HTTPS version, but there will be, or you probably didn't even notice, but there was a redirect. So actually, when entering this, I came to the HTTP version, and it redirected me to the HTTPS version. So in other words, an attacker could just prevent that you ever get to the HTTPS version. And this is why it makes sense to include this header. Another attack scenario, it could be that you're not getting presented the right certificate for a certain domain. So for example, an attacker just exchanges a certificate with his own, the classical man-in-the-middle attack. Or, variant B, it can be that the certificate authority is compromised. So you've seen, for example, if I compromise, for example, this GTSCA, I could easily issue a certificate for Google myself, and browsers would trust it. The solution to prevent this is called HTTP public key pinning, or HPKP. And you see, or you have seen, that a lot of websites already have troubles implementing this mechanism here. With HPKP, it's even worse. But let me explain why. So, as you can guess, or if I've already hinted, our browsers trust around 130 trust stores. So whenever a certificate chain is resolved by a browser, the browser goes back here and it will end up at such a root certificate. So this Google Trust Services here, for example, this is trusted. This is within my browser, this is within this list of certificates. And only if the chain ends up at such a root certificate, only then my browser will trust it. And remember back what we had in the very beginning of this lecture. First, the browser compares if the hostname you just called matches the name it sees in the certificate, and then the path is resolved. The problem is, well, usually, for example, the chain for Google looks like this. Or like, yeah, instead of global sign here, I just have Google Trust Services. They just renamed it, yeah. But what if, for example, I mean, your browser would also, let's say your browser also trusts this issue here, Turk Trust, and your browser does by default settings. If they issue a certificate for google.com, would you notice? And for example, what you can do as an attacker, you could just, instead of so usually when you go to google.com, first there is DNS request, DNS reply, which you get, and then the DNS reply includes the IP address of Google service. Well, as an attacker, you would just fake the DNS reply, enter another IP address, the user would end up at another server overall, and you could, for example, present him with, well, a certificate hierarchy that could look like this. The user would never notice, because the browser also trusts this issuer. So that's the crucial thing. You do not, the browser trusts all these 130 certificates. And there is no way to detect this if, so there are some improvements to that's been made to detect that, to have some sort of directory who issued certificate. This is called certificate transparency. So for example, Google can, all the certificate authorities meanwhile are forced to enter all certificates they issued into a database called certificate transparency. But if they do not do so, for example, because the CA is hacked, then it will never show up there. And just as a side note, because it comes to my mind, and I brought the example, if you go to a newspaper page or if you go to Google.at, if you just enter, for example, Google.at, what my browser first does, it loads the HTTP version. And browser vendors lately have Google and Chrome basically, Google and Mozilla have thought of an option which you can enable in the settings of your browser to say always prefer HTTPS. So previously there was an add-in called HTTPS Everywhere, which would try the HTTPS version first and only fall back if there was no other option. So meanwhile, browser vendors have said, well, with such an extensive proliferation of HTTPS, so more than 90% of websites use HTTPS, why would browsers always try HTTP first? It would exactly grant attackers a way to perform such an attack, because what if a server owner does not use HTTPS? Or in this case, what if, for example, a CA like Turk Trust is hacked and you would see such a certificate? This is exactly the scenario that happened a few times in the past, that a scenario was hacked. The attacker had access to trusted CA, he would just issue a certificate for arbitrary hostnames. This is especially interesting for less democratic regimes to, for example, issue certificates that seem valid but are not. For example, for Google.com, YouTube.com, Twitter.com. What's also possible is an attacker performs a man-in-the-middle attack and shows the user the previously generated certificate. This would be exactly the setting here. Let's try this one here. No, where do we have it? Yeah, this one uses HSTS, which is why my browser is clever enough. Or it doesn't do anything right now. Yeah, it does. So it doesn't let me continue. So, but if there was no HSTS, Chrome would just offer to continue anyway. So if an attacker, for example, performs a man-in-the-middle attack, and you'd say, oh, I desperately have to go to this website, and you click to continue anyway, then the attacker will just show you the crafted, the fraudulent certificate, and you will continue anyway. So to prevent such kind of attacks of hacked CAs, of attackers being able to show you arbitrary certificates, there is a mechanism called HTTP public key pinning, and the idea is that your browser will remember the hashes, the hash values of the public keys associated with the certificates of a chain. And if for example, in this chain here, here's a public key in a certificate, here's a public key, here's a public key. You'd calculate the hashes, the hash values, and tell them the browser to remember. If the browser will then see, okay, the hash value is different here, 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 it would just refuse this chain. And again, similar to HSTS, these hash values are sent in the header of a website. So you would just take the public key, generate, for example, the SHA-256 hash, then use base 64 for encoding here, and do this, for example, for, well, this can be configured. You can do it only for a last certificate in a chain. You can also do it for example, for the intermediate. There's some options for the server owner. And of course, a max age, and includes subdomains. This has the same role as with HSTS. So if this is enabled, what will happen is that the browser will just see, is the public key from certificate I received actually, if the hash value of the public key, does it correspond to the one I've remembered from previous times? If it is, then we're all good. If it's not, then communication will not happen. So this effectively prevents attacks where certificate authorities are hacked, or it will make it more, let's say, more challenging for attackers in the man-in-the-middle case that the user is tricked into accepting an self-generated certificate. The problem is, I mean, this mechanism has its purpose. The problem is it's overly complicated to set up. So a lot of people fail from just deriving the right pins. They're calculating, for example, a hash value on the whole certificate instead of only the public key pin, or they just specify one pin, but by definition, so that browsers will actually use this, there has to be at least 2 pins. A lot of things can go wrong, and since there's also an HTTP header in the response here, if an attacker would just strip this header away, there is no preload for that. If an attacker would just strip this, then the browser would never remember this. And then there's also a practical issue, because what if, for example, you say, well, this is the pins that the client should expect, but then you suddenly have to change your certificate and generate a new key pair, then of course these pins will also be different. So it will just happen that users will no longer be able to access your website. You will just block them because the pins will mismatch. They will still be stored in the browser memory, in the cache, and users can no longer access. So this is why conceptually this technique is valuable and reasonable, but barely used. But something you should, if you own a server or ever should get in touch with that, or if you think, well, your banking website should make sure there's never communication over HTTP possible, then HSTS is truly recommendable. Well, that's it for today. Next time we will have a closer look on TLS vulnerabilities and how recent attacks worked and what you can do or where, for example, TLS usually fails. There's for either the different attack vectors. Some work on the actual implementation of TLS, some on the protocol layer. So, and I'll also try to make it quite practical and tell you and show you how recent attacks, why they worked out successfully. And then also, as the last part, a quick look on DNS security, because I hinted it already today. Sometimes it's possible, for example, if you're such an attacker here, you would just try to bring the user to another IP address that features something like a phishing page of Google, and there's a mechanism to make sure that such DNS redirects are not possible unauthorized. So that's also something for next time. Then there will be a short break, and at the end of January the lecture exam is scheduled. So I hope you enjoyed it. As always, if there are questions, you're very welcome to ask them. See you next time then for TLS vulnerabilities and attacks.